The ocean floor holds stories the land has forgotten. Ancient myths that vanished from continents survive in the deep, preserved by the sea for millennia. You will discover exactly how the water became a perfect time capsule for our cultural heritage. We will uncover why shipwrecks guard tales lost to erosion and how isolated islanders kept epic narratives pure. This journey reveals a hidden history where the ocean's silence speaks louder than all the libraries on land. What forgotten truth might the waves be keeping for us? On land, stories were whispered from one generation to the next, a fragile chain of memory easily broken. A single war, a great migration, or even a shift in the climate could erase an epic poem or a creation myth forever. But the sea offered a different kind of sanctuary. It became a cultural time capsule of incredible durability. Think of a story carved into the wood of a trading vessel sailing across the known world. When that ship sank, its cargo of tales was not lost. It was sealed in a cold, dark, and silent vault, protected from the very forces that ravaged the land. These stories, embedded in the wreckage and carried along ancient maritime routes, found a way to endure. Isolated island communities, surrounded by the immense blue, became their own unique repositories. Cut off from the constant churn of continental cultures, they could preserve narratives in a state of near purity for centuries. The ocean's very nature, its vastness, and the stability of its deep water environments created perfect conditions for mythic continuity. This reveals the sea's true role. It was not merely a barrier separating peoples, but a narrative conservator, a keeper of our oldest voices. The sea created more than just shipwreck vaults. It forged living libraries on remote shores, far across the Pacific, on isolated Polynesian atolls. Generations of storytellers preserved epic tales of ancestral voyages across the starry ocean. These communities, surrounded by endless blue, became cultural fortresses. Their geographic seclusion was their greatest strength. While myths on the vast continents were constantly reshaped by invading armies, new religions, or the slow blending of neighboring cultures, these islands remained untouched. The very water that isolated them also insulated their stories. A creation chant passed down for 1,000 years on a small island could remain almost identical to its original form, a feat nearly impossible on the interconnected mainland. The ocean, by its simple presence, created pockets of pure cultural memory, safeguarding ancient narratives from the homogenizing forces that swept across the land. This is the ocean's first and most profound method of preservation. It did not just lock stories away in the deep. It built living, breathing worlds where those stories could continue, unchanged for centuries. But these living island libraries were not the only way the ocean preserved our past. The sea itself was a vast, pulsing network of story. Ancient maritime trade routes became the world's first information superhighways. Picture a Phoenician merchant vessel, its hull laden with precious silks and exotic spices. Its most enduring cargo, however, was not physical. It was the stories exchanged in busy ports, the tales of leviathans seen in uncharted waters and foreign gods worshipped in distant lands. These sea lanes, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, acted as dynamic conduits for myth. A story born in Egypt could travel to Greece, be adapted by Roman sailors, and find a new home in Carthage, all while its original version on land was being forgotten. Why did these oceanic stories have such resilience? Overland routes were constantly severed by the rise and fall of empires, by shifting borders and devastating conflicts. A trade road through a war-torn valley would fall silent, but the sea lanes, for the most part, remained open. The ocean was a shared space, a connective tissue between civilizations that often could not reach each other by land. This constant, refreshing flow of people and ideas meant that a narrative, once it reached the maritime world, could achieve a kind of immortality. It would be told and retold, passed from one ship to the next, evolving with each journey but never truly dying. The ocean did not just preserve stories in frozen isolation. It kept them alive through relentless circulation, ensuring that the myths of the water outlived the myths of the earth. Yet the most tangible evidence of the ocean's memory lies in its shipwrecks. Think of a Roman cargo ship laden with amphorae, sinking into the cold, dark mud of the Mediterranean. On land, its wooden hull and any fragile papyrus scrolls it carried would have decomposed in a matter of centuries. But here, in the oxygen-starved depths, a miracle of preservation occurs. The deep sea is a silent, cold vault, and materials that would have turned to dust on land can survive for millennia. The most astonishing finds are not just the coins or pottery, but the stories physically inscribed onto the artifacts themselves. A votive statue dedicated to a sea god recovered from the silt carries with it the prayer and the myth of the person who offered it. The carvings on a ship's prow might tell a forgotten tale of a heroic voyage. These shipwrecks are accidental time capsules, sealed by the water the moment they sank. This principle extends beyond single ships to entire cities. Off the coast of Egypt, the legendary city of Thonis Heraclean now lies completely submerged. On land, its temples and libraries would have been plundered for stone, built over by new civilizations, or simply worn away by wind and sand. But the sea claimed it whole. The ruins of its grand temples and the inscriptions on its fallen statues have been kept in a state of suspended animation. They offer a pristine, almost frozen glimpse into the mythic worldviews of the people who lived there. We can read their stories directly from the stone, stories that were erased everywhere else. While land archaeology constantly battles the layers of newer civilizations built on top of the old, these underwater sites remain undisturbed. The very waters that swallowed these places became their ultimate protector, safeguarding the physical objects that encoded our oldest narratives. So what other lost chapters of human belief might be waiting, perfectly preserved, in the deep? An old fisherman mending his nets might tell you a story his grandfather told him, a tale of a phantom ship that no historian inland has ever heard. This was the everyday reality of coastal life. Sailors and fishermen were not just workers on the water, they were the dedicated librarians of a vast, unwritten archive of myth. Their oral traditions were filled with sea deities, ghostly islands, and strange omens, but these were far more than simple superstitions. They were a vital form of practical knowledge, a survival guide encoded in narrative. The story of a goddess who stirred the waves into a storm was a way to remember the signs of an approaching squall. The legend of a kraken that dragged ships into the abyss served as a warning about dangerous, uncharted whirlpools. For these communities, myth was not a relic of the past, it was essential, living wisdom. This created a deeply conservative cultural environment. In a world where a single mistake could mean death, you did not casually change the old ways or the old stories. Every tale had a purpose, every chant a function. This profound need for reliable knowledge ensured that these maritime myths were transmitted across generations with remarkable fidelity. A father would teach his son the exact story his own father had taught him because the details mattered. On land, folklore could evolve and change with fashion and politics. But out on the open ocean, where the rules were written by wind and wave, the old stories were preserved not for entertainment but for survival. The sea itself demanded it. The idea of the ocean as a deep memory is woven into the very fabric of ancient belief. Greek poets spoke of the river Lethe, a stream within the underworld whose waters brought oblivion to those who drank. But the vast salt sea was often seen as its opposite, a realm of enduring knowledge. This was not a coincidence. Many cultures, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, intuitively understood the sea's mnemonic power. Polynesian navigators did not merely sail upon the water, they listened to it. They believed the ocean itself held the whispers of their ancestors, that every wave and current carried the stories of those who had sailed before. This symbolic link between the sea and memory created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. A society that revered the ocean as a keeper of stories was far more likely to entrust its most vital narratives to maritime context. Epic poems were recited on long voyages, sacred chants were performed at the shoreline, and myths of creation were tied directly to the movements of the tides. Why would they do this? Because they believed the sea would remember. This profound symbolic association went beyond any practical need for navigation or survival. It was a spiritual conviction that the ocean was a living library. This belief, in turn, ensured that the most important cultural knowledge was constantly placed in the very environment best suited to preserve it, both physically and in the collective imagination. The ocean preserved our myths not just by chance, but because we asked it to. We recognized its silent, eternal nature as the perfect guardian for our most cherished stories, creating a legacy where the symbolic and the practical merged into one unbreakable bond. Polynesian star chants hold entire maps of the Pacific. These were not simple tales for entertainment, but intricate, functional cosmologies committed to memory. Each chant was a living atlas encoding the precise positions of stars, the subtle patterns of ocean swells, and the flight paths of land-finding birds. This complex body of knowledge, passed down through generations of navigators, formed a mythic system that guided canoes across thousands of miles of open ocean. The survival of entire communities depended on the flawless transmission of these stories. A single error in a star sequence or a misremembered wave pattern could lead a vessel into the endless blue, never to be seen again. This life or death necessity created an unparalleled system of preservation. On the vast continents, where one could always find a landmark or ask for directions, such precise navigational lore was often allowed to fade, replaced by maps and written guides. But in the Pacific, the myths had to remain perfect. They were the only map there was. When European explorers first made contact, they were astonished. They encountered cultures whose oral traditions contained a sophisticated science of the sea, a science that many land-based civilizations had long forgotten. The Polynesians could read the ocean as if it were a written text, a skill preserved for centuries within the sacred vessel of myth. Their stories were the library, the chart, and the compass, all woven into one unbroken song that the ocean itself helped them keep. The Norse world was bound by sea lanes, not by roads. Aboard their legendary longships, Viking explorers and traders carried more than cargo. They carried entire worlds of myth. Skalds, the poets and storytellers, recited epic sagas of the trickster god Loki and the mighty Thor, their voices rising above the crash of waves. They told of Jörmungandr, the monstrous world serpent coiled at the bottom of the sea, and of Ran, the treacherous goddess who used her net to drag sailors to a watery grave. These were not just fantastical tales, they were a spiritual compass for a people whose lives were defined by the ocean's peril and promise. As Viking ships pushed further west, establishing settlements in Iceland and Greenland, these myths traveled with them. The sea routes became the vital arteries through which the lifeblood of Norse culture continued to flow. This created a remarkable cultural phenomenon. Back in mainland Scandinavia, the slow and steady spread of Christianity was gradually transforming the old beliefs. The pagan gods were being abandoned, their stories fading from memory on the land where they were born. But out in the Atlantic, on the remote shores of Iceland, something different was happening. The very isolation that defined these island settlements, connected only by the dangerous sea journeys back to the homeland, became a protective barrier. The old ways, the old stories, held a stronger grip in these maritime outposts. They were a direct link to the cultural identity of the settlers, a treasured inheritance they had risked their lives to carry across the ocean. And it was in Iceland, centuries later, that this rich oral tradition was finally committed to parchment. Works like the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda were written down, preserving in stunning detail the entire Norse cosmological system. This literary miracle was no accident. It was the direct result of an ocean-connected culture that valued its seafaring heritage. The myths had not survived in the heart of Scandinavia. They had been safeguarded by the periphery, by the islands that the ocean had kept separate. The water did not erase their stories. It gave them a permanent home, ensuring that the voice of the Vikings would echo long after their mainland halls fell silent. The Mediterranean holds a memory of a great drowning. Across ancient Greece, the story of Deucalion's flood was told and retold. But it was in the coastal cities and on the islands that the tale retained its most chilling and specific details. These maritime communities spoke of walls of water and a relentless rising sea that swallowed the land whole. Far to the east, the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, a story traded along sea routes, describes a flood of terrifying realism, with a hero ordered to build a boat to precise dimensions to survive the deluge. Inland cultures also had their flood myths, but these stories often softened into allegory, becoming tales of divine punishment where the specifics of the water itself faded away. Yet along the coastlines, the story remained starkly geological. Why would this be? The people living by the shore witnessed the evidence every day. They saw submerged forests and sunken ruins just offshore. The constant, visible presence of the encroaching sea kept the narrative grounded in a tangible, physical reality. It was not just a myth, it was a local history. Modern science now confirms what these stories preserved. At the end of the last ice age, as glaciers melted, the Mediterranean Sea rose at an astonishing rate, swallowing vast stretches of coastal plains. The memory of this traumatic event, the loss of entire landscapes to the waves, was seared into the cultural memory of the survivors. Their descendants, generation after generation, living by that same unpredictable sea, kept the story alive and accurate. They preserved not just a fable, but a record of a real geological event, a memory of the world that was lost when the waters came. Inland, the flood became a symbol. On the coast, it remained a report. The climate itself became a silent guardian of these coastal stories. While inland empires rose and fell to the rhythm of drought and famine, the world along the shore existed in a different tempo. The ocean moderates the air around it, creating a buffer against the wild temperature swings that can devastate continental interiors. Coastal communities rarely faced the kind of apocalyptic crop failures or mass migrations triggered by a decade of relentless drought. Their societies remained more stable, their populations more continuous. This environmental consistency provided a fertile ground for cultural continuity. A storyteller could pass a myth to his apprentice without the interruption of a war for resources or the desperate flight of his people. The rituals honoring the sea god were performed on the same beach, generation after generation, their meaning and form preserved with a clarity that inland cultures could only envy. For a land-based civilization, a single volcanic winter or a century of abnormal heat could shatter the social order. The great library might burn, the priestly class might scatter, and the intricate stories they guarded could be simplified, merged with conquerors' tales, or lost entirely. Their mythic heritage became fragmented, like a mosaic broken by an earthquake, but by the sea, the rhythm of life was set by the tides, not by the erratic weather. The stories told were those of floods and voyages, narratives that remained relevant and vital across countless lifetimes. This fundamental climatic advantage meant that the oldest songs had a much greater chance of surviving intact, carried on the salt air of a world that changed far more slowly than the land. A waterlogged scroll, carefully unrolled in a laboratory, held a hymn to Poseidon that no scholar had ever seen. This was not found in a desert cave or a monastery library, but recovered from a sunken ship believed to be part of the legendary Alexandrian fleet. The words, preserved by the sea's cold, anoxic mud, praised the sea god with epithets and promises of sacrifice that were entirely new to history. On land, such a delicate papyrus would have crumbled to dust in centuries. Here, in its dark, watery vault, it survived for 2 millennia, waiting to rewrite a small piece of what we thought we knew. This is the power of modern maritime archaeology. It is no longer just about recovering amphorae and coins, but about opening the ocean's long-sealed archives, from Bronze Age shipwrecks in the Aegean carrying strange, foreign cult statues to their new homes, to the submerged temples of Thonis Heraclean, whose walls are carved with unique creation myths. Each dive site confirms a profound truth. The ocean did not merely save objects, it saved entire worldviews that vanished from the land. We have long pieced together ancient beliefs from fragments found in ruined cities, assuming our terrestrial evidence gave us the complete picture. But the sea consistently offers a different version, a corrected and expanded narrative. It presents us with religious practices that were thought to be extinct, and myths that fill in the blank spaces of our historical understanding. What other foundational stories are waiting in the silt, ready to challenge the myths we have always accepted as complete? This process of myth-making mirrors the growth of a coral reef. A coral reef is not a single entity, but a vast, living structure built over thousands of years. Each generation of tiny coral polyps builds its own calcium carbonate skeleton upon the foundations of its ancestors, creating a complex, layered architecture. The reef's deepest, most ancient core remains intact, even as new life flourishes on its surface. This is precisely how maritime cultures constructed their mythological worlds. They did not typically erase the old to make way for the new. Instead, they built upon it slowly and deliberately. An ancient sea deity from a forgotten people might be absorbed into the pantheon of a new civilization, becoming a lesser spirit or a different aspect of a more powerful god. The story of a local sea monster would be woven into the epic of a great hero, preserving the archaic creature within a more modern narrative. This created a stratified system of belief, where the oldest layers of myth were not discarded but simply buried under newer, more relevant stories. On land, mythology often experienced revolutions. A conquering army would arrive with its own gods, and the old deities would be violently overthrown and forgotten. But the sea does not favor such sudden upheavals. Its culture was one of slow accumulation, of adding new voyages to old maps. This continuous, accretive process meant that the most archaic, foundational elements of belief were safeguarded within the growing structure. They were never thrown away, only built upon. So when we study these oceanic mythologies, we are not looking at a single story from a single time. We are looking at a cultural reef, its deepest layers holding secrets that the land has long since scrubbed away. We can see this remarkable preservation in the enduring image of the sea serpent. Across the globe, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the warm waters of the South Pacific, descriptions of these oceanic monsters share a startling similarity. They are almost universally depicted as immense, elongated creatures with humped backs, often seen coiling through the waves or rearing a horse-like head from the water. This consistent archetype, passed along ancient sea lanes, stands in stark contrast to the chaotic diversity of land dragons. In China, the dragon is a benevolent, serpentine deity associated with rivers and rain. In medieval Europe, it is a winged, fire-breathing beast hoarding treasure in a cave. The land dragon has no fixed form, its appearance shifting wildly with local geography and belief. Why would the sea serpent remain so consistent while its terrestrial cousin transformed into 100 different shapes? The answer lies in the ocean's unique environment. The sea, while vast, presented a common set of challenges and wonders to every culture that sailed upon it. A sailor from Portugal and a fisherman from Japan, though separated by an entire world, both witnessed the same immense, mysterious creature, the whale. They both experienced the same terrifying power of a rogue wave that could be interpreted as the movement of a colossal body. The sea itself provided a shared, tangible reference point. The myth was anchored in a universal, observable reality. On land, however, cultural exchange was a turbulent process. A dragon myth carried along the Silk Road would be adopted by a desert culture with no concept of a forest, and so the creature would shed its leafy camouflage and grow scales suited to the sand. It would be conquered by a mountain people who would give it wings to soar between peaks. Each new civilization, each new landscape, reinvented the land dragon to fit its own environment and fears. The ocean, by its immense and isolating nature, filtered out this noise. It created a stable, worldwide network where the core elements of a sea story could survive intact, precisely because every sailor, everywhere, was essentially reading from the same page of the same vast blue book. The design of a ship is a story made of wood and rope, but the most enduring story it carries is the one that explains its own existence. The development of seafaring technology did more than just move people across the water. It created entire cultural ecosystems where myth and practical knowledge became one unbreakable unit. Consider the Polynesian outrigger canoe. Its unique design, with a lateral support float, was a revolutionary invention that allowed for the settlement of the Pacific. But the knowledge of why this shape was stable, how to read the ocean swells it rode upon, and how to steer it by the stars was not stored in a technical manual. It was encoded in myth. A chant about the god Maui fishing up the islands was also a lesson in wayfinding, its verses filled with celestial markers and ocean current patterns. This created what we might call a technical mythical complex, a complete package where the vessel, the method of navigation, and the sacred stories explaining it all survived together. You could not separate the myth from the machine. The utility of the knowledge guaranteed the purity of the tale. If a navigator forgot a single star sequence from the creation chant, his canoe might miss its landfall by hundreds of miles. This life or death necessity enforced a level of fidelity in oral transmission that land-based ceremonial myths never faced. A story told at a seasonal festival could drift and change over generations without immediate, catastrophic consequences. But a story that was also a nautical chart had to remain perfect. The myth survived because the technology demanded it. The lateen sail, that triangular marvel that allowed Arab D-house to tack against the wind, carried its own mythology. The knowledge of how to rig it, when to adjust it, and which winds it could harness was wrapped in tales of jinn who controlled the air and prophets who blessed the voyages. To learn the craft of sailing was to learn the legends. This fusion of the practical and the sacred meant that the myths associated with these technologies were not casual folklore. They were the core curriculum of a maritime culture, repeated with precision until they became as reliable as the hull beneath a sailor's feet. The ocean preserved these stories not in spite of their complexity, but because of it. Their very utility made them immortal. The legend of Atlantis was never a story told by farmers. It is a myth born of the sea, passed from sailor to sailor across the rolling waves. For 2,000 years, this tale of a sophisticated island kingdom swallowed by the ocean in a single day and night has captivated the human imagination, despite the complete absence of any physical proof on any continent. Why has this particular story of loss endured with such power? The answer lies in the unique relationship between coastal peoples and the water that both sustained and threatened them. Legends of sunken lands like Atlantis or the Pacific realm of Mu are not mere fantasies. They are likely the preserved folk memories of real, catastrophic geological events that devastated maritime societies. A volcanic island collapsing into the caldera it once was, like the eruption that may have inspired the Atlantis myth, would have been a localized apocalypse for any culture living on its shores. The resulting tsunamis would have ravaged coastal communities for hundreds of miles, etching a story of sudden, unimaginable loss into the survivors' minds. Similarly, as the glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically, swallowing entire coastal plains that were once home to thriving settlements. For the people who lived through these events, it was not a slow, creeping change. It was a visible, relentless invasion of the sea, a trauma that demanded an explanation. These narratives of submergence became vital cautionary tales, repeated for generations to ensure that no one forgot the awesome, destructive power of the ocean. Inland cultures experienced their own disasters, of course. They told stories of great fires sent by angry gods, or of the earth opening up to swallow cities whole. But their myths reflected their own environment. They were stories of earth and fire. The coastal peoples, living with the constant sight and sound of the waves, told stories of water. The ocean itself was the main character in their dramas of loss, a constant reminder of the event that shaped their cultural identity. This is why the myth of the sunken continent feels so universal to us, yet remains so stubbornly tied to the maritime world. It is the deep, echoing memory of the shore, a story the water helped write and would not let us forget. The ocean is a psychological trigger. Its sheer scale and inherent danger force the human mind into a state of heightened awareness, and in that state, stories are not just heard, they are branded into memory. Psychologists have found that our brains are hardwired to prioritize information linked to survival, and for any culture connected to the sea, nearly every myth was intertwined with survival. A story about a storm-summoning goddess was not a fantasy, it was a critical weather forecast. A legend of a reef haunted by sirens was a vital navigational warning. This practical life-or-death relevance created a cognitive anchor, ensuring these tales were repeated with absolute precision. Fathers taught sons not for entertainment, but for the son's future life. The stakes were simply too high for the details to drift. Compare this to a land-based folktale about a trickster rabbit. It might be charming, and it might teach a gentle lesson, but no one's survival depends on remembering the exact color of the rabbit's fur. That story is free to evolve, to be embellished or simplified with each telling. But a story that explains how to avoid a killer whirlpool, that one has to be perfect. Every word, every sequence is a piece of essential data. The ocean, by its constant threat, enforced a discipline in storytelling that the more forgiving land never could. Beyond pure survival, the sea also evokes a profound sense of awe, a feeling of the sublime that psychologists know enhances memory formation. Standing on a shore, looking out at an infinite horizon, or being tossed in a small boat on towering waves, these experiences are emotionally charged. They are frightening and beautiful all at once. When a myth is born from or told within such a context, it borrows that emotional power. The story becomes inseparable from the feeling of awe itself. You do not just remember the tale of the sea serpent, you remember the chill on your skin and the vast, empty blue that made the story feel terrifyingly possible. This combination, the raw necessity for survival information wrapped in the unforgettable cloak of awe, created the perfect psychological conditions for mythic preservation. The ocean did not just keep stories safe from physical erosion, it etched them directly into our collective mind, ensuring they would outlast the civilizations that first gave them voice. A sailor never simply launched a boat. The act was always a ceremony, a sacred drama played out on the shore. Before the first rope was cast off, there would be invocations to Poseidon or to Ran, the Norse goddess of the sea, accompanied by the precise recitation of myths that explained their power and their temper. These maritime rituals were not optional. They were as vital to the voyage as the hull itself, and they created a powerful, structured engine for mythic preservation that land cultures rarely matched. Think of a farming community's harvest festival. Its rituals and stories were tied to the land, and if the climate shifted or a new crop was introduced, the old ceremonies could lose their relevance and begin to change. The story of a rain god might fade during a century of good weather, but the sea was different. Its fundamental dangers did not change. For thousands of years, a storm was a storm, a hidden reef was a death sentence, and the fear of being lost in the blue vastness was a universal constant. This timelessness lent an incredible stability to the rituals that addressed these perils. The chant to calm a squall had to be performed the same way every time, because the consequence of getting it wrong was always the same. This turned seafaring communities into something resembling a global, decentralized religion. Their rituals, from the blessing of a new net to the desperate prayers offered during a gale, were like a liturgy. And like a liturgy, they required the precise, verbatim repetition of sacred narratives. A father teaching his son the proper way to offer a sacrifice to the wind gods was not improvising a story. He was passing down a fixed script, a technological and spiritual protocol that had been proven over generations. The myth and the ritual were locked together, each one preserving the other. While a land-based folktale could be shortened, embellished, or combined with another story around a winter fire, the sea demanded absolute fidelity. The ritual was the cage that kept the myth from evolving, ensuring that the oldest prayers to the oldest gods were the ones that survived, perfectly intact, long after their inland counterparts had been forgotten or transformed beyond recognition. The words a sailor uses can be a time capsule all on their own. Isolated fishing villages and remote island communities often became linguistic islands as well, preserving ancient forms of speech that contained within them the fossilized remains of older myths. Along the stormy coasts of the Bay of Biscay, the Basque language has endured for millennia, a mysterious survivor with no known relatives in Europe. This was not a language of kings or courts, but one of fishermen and whalers. Within its unique vocabulary are words for sea deities and mythical creatures that simply do not exist in Spanish or French. The very structure of the language, preserved by a community whose life was defined by the ocean, holds a mythological understanding that the rest of the continent forgot. A single Basque word for a type of ocean whirlpool might also imply a legendary serpent's lair, a dual meaning lost when the concept was translated into other tongues. This phenomenon repeated itself across the world's oceans. In the Pacific, linguists studying closely related languages found something remarkable. On large, interconnected islands, the languages evolved rapidly, shedding complex grammatical structures. But on tiny, isolated atolls, the older language forms were preserved with stunning fidelity. These archaic grammatical rules often encoded a completely different way of seeing the world. A verb tense used only for ancestral heroes, or a specific pronoun reserved for speaking about mythical sea spirits, kept these concepts alive and active within everyday speech. On the Big Islands, these linguistic nuances vanished, and with them, the subtle layers of the myth they represented faded from memory. The ocean, by isolating these communities, gave their languages a kind of cultural inertia. The words themselves became the library, and the simple act of speaking was an act of preservation. When an elder told a story using the old terms, they were not just recounting a tale, they were unlocking a vault of meaning that had been built into the language centuries before. The myth lived not just in the narrative, but in the very syllables used to tell it. Imperial powers arrived with a singular focus on dismantling the old world. They understood that to control a people, you must first conquer their gods. Across continents, missionaries and soldiers targeted the grand temples and centralized priesthoods of land-based empires. The codices of the Maya were burned, the sacred groves of West Africa were felled, and the intricate mythologies of North American tribes were systematically suppressed. These were visible hierarchical systems of belief, and they presented a clear and present threat to colonial authority. But out on the water, a different story was unfolding. The myths of the sea were not housed in grand stone structures. They were not managed by a powerful, centralized clergy. They lived in the daily rhythms of fishermen mending their nets, in the quiet chants of navigators before a long voyage, in the superstitions whispered on a rolling deck. This decentralized, almost invisible nature of maritime tradition made it far more difficult to target and destroy. A colonial administrator could easily order the demolition of a temple, but how do you erase a story told by a father to his son on a lonely beach? The very diffuseness that made these myths seem primitive to the colonizers became their greatest shield. The focus of suppression was squarely on the land, and in that shadow, the ocean stories quietly endured. Furthermore, the colonial project itself was dependent on the sea. European ships needed local pilots to guide them through treacherous, unfamiliar waters. They relied on the knowledge of islanders who understood the currents and the stars. In the process of extracting this practical information, they often recorded the myths that were inseparable from it. A British naval officer, for instance, might document a Polynesian star chant not for its cultural beauty, but because it contained a reliable map to a safe harbor. A Portuguese trader would write down a tale of a sea monster not as a cherished legend, but as a navigational hazard to be noted on a chart. This created a profound and tragic paradox. Just as colonial contact was beginning to erode the living oral traditions, the colonizers' own logs and diaries were capturing these myths in written form, freezing them in time. The very force that sought to overwrite indigenous cultures was accidentally creating a permanent, written backup of the maritime knowledge it needed to exploit. The stories were saved, but often at the cost of the culture that gave them life, preserved in the archives of the powers that had set out to erase them. A cultural current is now flowing in reverse. After centuries of safeguarding ancient narratives, the ocean is returning its preserved treasures to the land. In Hawaii, a profound cultural revival is underway, powered by myths that never left the water. For generations, the art of wayfinding, of navigating vast ocean distances by stars, waves, and birds, was kept alive by a tiny, dedicated few on isolated islands. Their chants were not just stories, they were living maps encoding a sophisticated science of the sea. This knowledge, preserved with absolute precision because a single error meant death on the open ocean, had largely faded from the main Hawaiian islands. But today, something beautiful is happening. The descendants of those who forgot are learning from the descendants of those who remembered. Modern Hawaiians are rebuilding their great double-hulled voyaging canoes, not from museum blueprints, but by following the architectural principles described in the old chants. They are relearning their ancestral language and cosmology by studying the same star myths that guided their ancestors across the Pacific. The ocean, which insulated this knowledge for so long, is now the source from which the land is drinking, rehydrating a cultural landscape that had grown parched. A similar return is echoing across northern Spain. The Basque language and its unique sea myths survived for millennia in coastal fishing villages, a linguistic fortress against the tides of history. Inland, however, far from the sound of the waves, many of these traditions had softened or vanished. Now, a cultural reclamation project is bringing the ocean stories back home. Artists from the industrial interior are traveling to the coast, listening to the elders, and weaving tales of the sea goddess Mary and her stormy temper into modern paintings and literature. School children in cities like Victoria Gasteiz, 100 kilometers from the coast, are learning songs about the Balia, a mythical whale creature that their great-grandparents inland never knew. The myths deposited for safekeeping in the maritime world are being withdrawn to enrich an identity that had become disconnected from its own depth. This reverse transmission completes a remarkable cycle. The ocean acted as a cultural savings account, patiently holding our stories in trust while the volatile markets of continental history rose and fell. Now, with a renewed hunger for roots, we are making a withdrawal, and the wealth we are recovering is immeasurable. The very myths that the land could not hold onto have been kept safe for us, waiting in the one vault that never closes. The oral tradition is fading, but a new kind of current is carrying these ancient stories forward. We are now entering an era of digital preservation, where technology is becoming the new ocean for our oldest myths. High-definition cameras descend into the deep, capturing the ghostly hull of a shipwreck in stunning detail. These are not just images, they are data points. Every barnacle-encrusted amphora, every carving on a waterlogged beam, can be scanned and recreated in a three-dimensional virtual space. A researcher in a landlocked city can now put on a headset and float through a digital reconstruction of the sunken city of Thonis Heraclean, reading inscriptions on temple walls that have rested on the seabed for 2,000 years. This technological leap is monumental. It means the physical degradation of these sites, a natural process even underwater, no longer means the total loss of the information they hold. We are creating perfect digital twins of these underwater time capsules, but the preservation goes beyond the physical. Audio recorders capture the last native speakers of isolated maritime languages, saving not just the words but the specific cadence and emotion with which a myth is told. The chants of Polynesian navigators, once heard only by a chosen few on a rocking canoe, are now stored on servers, accessible to a child in Tokyo or a student in Berlin. This digital archive is a new kind of deep, a vast and interconnected space where these stories can reside forever, safe from the erosion of time and memory. It is a metaphorical ocean, boundless and eternal. So what does this mean for the future of these narratives? The stories, once confined to the shorelines and the people who lived by them, are now set adrift on a global digital sea. They can wash up on any screen, anywhere, finding new audiences and inspiring new interpretations. The ocean preserved them in physical isolation for millennia. Now, the digital world promises to preserve them through universal connection, ensuring the myths the water guarded for so long never face extinction again. The very waters that guarded these stories for millennia are now turning against them. This is the great irony of our time. Climate change and a degraded ocean now pose the single greatest threat to the myths they once preserved. Rising sea levels do not just reshape coastlines, they erase them, swallowing the very villages where fishermen have kept ancient oral traditions alive for generations. These communities are living libraries, and as they are forced to relocate inland, their intimate connection to the sea is severed. The stories of specific coastal spirits, the chants for a particular tide, the legends tied to a now submerged rock formation, they lose their context and their meaning. The library is not just moving, it is dissolving. At the same time, ocean acidification is performing a quiet, chemical demolition on our submerged heritage. The increasing acidity of the seawater eats away at ancient wooden shipwrecks and the calcium carbonate of sunken temples. A carved statue that survived for 2,000 years in the stable deep can now, within decades, be reduced to a featureless lump. The physical evidence that encodes our oldest narratives is literally dissolving before we can even find it. This dual assault creates a profound urgency. We are in a race against time to document these ocean-preserved narratives, to record the last speakers of maritime languages, and to digitally map the archaeological sites that are crumbling away. The mission is no longer just about understanding the past, it is about a desperate act of conservation. We must now save the stories from the very element that saved them for so long. What will we lose if we are too late? A whaler's harpoon was more than a tool. It was a key that unlocked an entire cosmology of myth. The dangerous, specialized economies of the sea created unique social worlds where ancient stories were not just remembered but required. Consider the pearl divers of the Persian Gulf. For centuries, their perilous work descending to great depths on a single breath was governed by a rich tapestry of lore. They spoke of sea djinn and protective spirits, and these were not idle tales. The stories encoded vital safety protocols. A myth about a particular underwater cave being the home of a vengeful spirit was in reality a warning about dangerous nitrogen narcosis or deceptive currents in that specific location. The knowledge of how to dive, where to dive, and when to return to the surface was wrapped in these narratives. A master diver did not merely teach his apprentice a technique, he passed down the sacred stories that explained and safeguarded that technique. This fusion created a powerful, self-perpetuating system. The economic survival of the community depended on the successful harvest of pearls, and that success depended on the faithful transmission of the traditional knowledge, myths and all. This kept the entire cultural package intact. On land, the Industrial Revolution was rapidly dismantling old ways. The blacksmith's lore was made obsolete by the factory. The weaver's songs were silenced by the power loom, but the ocean resisted such swift industrialization. A modern fishing trawler is a technological marvel, yet the captain might still possess an oral map of fishing grounds passed down through his family, a map dotted with references to legendary creatures and sunken islands that mark the most fertile spots. The industry remained conservative because the ocean itself had not changed. Its dangers were the same, and the accumulated wisdom of generations, packaged in myth, still held practical value. The myth survived because the job remained the same. A whale hunt in the 19th century, for all its new technology, still operated on a body of knowledge about whale behavior, migration, and ocean weather that was centuries old. The chanty sung while hauling in a sail, the story told of the great white whale that symbolized the ocean's unforgiving nature. These were not entertainment. They were the operating system of a maritime profession, a system that could not be easily upgraded without losing something essential. So the myths lived on, not as folklore, but as the very bedrock of a working life, carried into the modern era on the decks of ships that still challenged the same ancient sea. These ancient sea stories, long held in the ocean's trust, are now washing ashore with a new urgency. As climate change pushes the marine world to the center of global attention, these preserved myths offer more than just a window into the past. They provide a symbolic language for our future. The tales of islanders who navigated by reading the waves and the stars are no longer just historical curiosities. They are profound lessons in observation and adaptation for a world learning to live with a rising ocean. The old story of a goddess who must be appeased to keep the seas calm transforms from a simple superstition into a powerful metaphor for the delicate balance we have disrupted. Our relationship with the planet is shifting from one of terrestrial dominance to one of necessary coexistence with the global sea, and we lack the cultural tools for this new reality. These oceanic myths, tested by millennia of human interaction with the water, can provide those tools. They reframe the ocean not as a resource to be exploited or a threat to be walled out, but as a living entity with which we must negotiate. The Polynesian understanding of the sea as a connective highway rather than a barrier could reshape how we think about global community in an age of climate migration. The Norse reverence for the world serpent Jörmungandr, a creature of immense power coiled in the deep, becomes a startling allegory for the sleeping giant of oceanic change we have now awakened. These narratives hold the accumulated wisdom of cultures that knew the sea intimately, and they carry perspectives that our land-centric modern world has largely forgotten. As we look to the ocean for solutions, from offshore wind energy to aquaculture, these myths can guide our ethical compass. They remind us that every technological venture into the marine realm carries a story, and that the most successful stories are those of respect and reciprocity. The ocean did not just save these myths as artifacts, it saved them as a kind of cultural seed bank, and the time for planting may be now. What new global stories will we write, guided by these ancient, water-softened voices? Continents were built on change, but the ocean was built on continuity. Our journey reveals a clear and profound truth. The land, with its shifting empires and volatile borders, constantly rewrote its own story, burying old gods under new ideologies. Yet the sea, with its timeless tides and isolating vastness, provided a sanctuary for narratives that the frantic pace of continental life could not sustain. We have seen how isolated islands became living libraries, how sunken cities were frozen in time, and how the very language of sailors encoded ancient wisdom. The ocean offered a unique combination of environmental stability, decentralized tradition, and life or death necessity that created perfect conditions for mythic preservation. These are not merely tales rescued from oblivion. They are lessons in cultural resilience. They demonstrate how stories survive not through monumental architecture, but through their integration into the daily rituals of survival and meaning. A Polynesian star chant, a Basque whaler's prayer, a Viking saga recited on a longship, these were the vital instruments of a life lived with the sea. They endured because they had to. As we navigate our own era of profound change with rising seas and a fractured global culture, these ocean-kept stories offer a different kind of compass. They remind us that wisdom often resides in the margins, in the quiet, overlooked places that move to a slower, deeper rhythm. They teach us about adaptation, observation, and respect for the immense forces that shape our world. The myths the water guarded for so long are now a gift back to the land, a chance to remember what we forgot. If this exploration of hidden histories resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the past's unexpected currents. We would love to hear from you, as well. Share any maritime myths from your own cultural background in the comments below.